Test.
Thank you.
Hello all. Whoa, sorry. Hello all. We will get going with our meeting here. So I'm going to, let's see, I guess we can start on the main things. Welcome to dispatch. We have, in fact, is Mary on? Mary, one of our co-chairs, Mary, will be online remotely here, so she is joining that way. And Murray and I will be at the front this time, but thank you for all the fish. We're both stepping down after this meeting.
Won't be so happy.
Joy across the realm. So we have blue sheets circulating somewhere. Yeah, great. And we have found a kind scribe. Thank you over there, Sean. Somebody wanted to do some Jabber relay. Ted's done that. Great. This is the first meeting. This is the note well statement. You need to understand all the things you're agreeing to if you get up and speak in here or hang out in here in general. You can find the references to them here. And with that, I want to jump into a little bit of agenda bash before we hit the other stuff. So let's see, get over to the agenda here. We mistakenly put this secret token URI scheme in the art area meeting, which it should not be. It should be at the dispatch meeting. So we're going to move that up to sort of up to the front with the HTTP header registration. So we'll do Mark's 2 drafts first and then move on to the other part of the agenda. They also have a little bit of open mic time at the end of the art area meeting, which I think a few people want to speak to. Any other agenda bashes we need to deal with? Your silence is stunning. So with that, let's see if there's anything. Okay, I need to talk about deadlines. So this is our proposed deadlines for the next IETF. Keep in mind, we do these deadlines to try and help you so that we can, better try and get things to the right place and make stuff actually happen before they're submitted at the very last minute, like you always all do. If you miss the deadlines, because you always do, well, then you go to the back of the line, because that's really all we can do. If we could do worse things, we would. The mailing lists, sorry, Murray and I don't care. We have 2 mailing lists, one for dispatch, okay, that's about documents need to go somewhere, and there's also the art area list. It's often these confused, but just be aware that there are the 2 mailing lists. So with that, let us jump into one of Mark's documents. Which one do you want to do first, Mark? Let's discuss headers.
Does the clicker work?
Yes. The clicker will click.
Awesome. Okay.
It's hard to use the mic and be in the pink box.
You can move the box.
Okay. Can I move the box? Excellent. Good morning. So right now we record our header fields for HTTP in a common registry, the permanent message header field names registry. We also have a provisional message header fields names registry, which I won't talk about right now. But in that registry, we have all the HTTP headers and a bunch of other stuff as well. And that was defined in RFC 3864. Graham Klein drove a lot of that. I did some of the HTTP stuff, and Jeff Mogul helped out as well, way back in 2004. Way back. And so in that registry, we've got HTTP headers, we've got net news, which is NNTP, we've got mail and MIME. I'm still a little shady about the distinction, but okay. And we do not have SIP. SIP has its own separate message header registry for reasons which escape me, but I'd love to hear about. So I raised an issue in the HTTP working group a while back. We're doing the HTTP core documents, revising the HTTP core specifications yet again. And I noticed this, and it had been bugging me for a while, that the HTTP headers were mixed up in this other registry, which had a couple of bad effects, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I raised an issue, and we discussed it in Montreal. And the feedback in the room was, yeah, probably makes sense to pull this out into a separate registry. But Alexi pointed out that we needed to talk to a greater community about that, because that registry was not set up by the HTTP working group. It was set up by another process. If I remember correctly, that was AD sponsored, but I could be misremembering. Dispatch didn't exist back then. But Dispatch is clearly the place to talk about this now. So that's why I'm here. Hello. And so I put together a straw man draft, which I haven't had a chance to submit yet. This is not what's formally being proposed in the HTTP working group, and it's not something for this group to discuss. But it does talk a little bit about the motivation for why we want to pull the HTTP headers out of that common registry into their own registry. And it's beyond things like just making it easier for people who are using HTTP to look through this huge laundry list of header field names and sort out which ones apply to HTTP. There's also things like it's difficult to evolve the registration process. We want to modernize the registration process. It's a lot harder to coordinate it between a lot of different communities than it is in just one community. User confusion, like I mentioned. The expert review process, it'd be nice to have an expert apply the HTTP criteria for headers and all the considerations that we've come up with, which are quite extensive in the HTTP documents, consistently to the headers, and to make sure that the HTTP community is appropriately involved. So that's my motivation. Alexi asked us to bring it to Dispatch. There seemed to be support in the HTTP community for doing this, and the question is, does this make sense to everyone else? And I already see an area director at the mic. I see an area director at the decoration.
There we go. Okay. So I was actually not here as an area director. I'm here as a SIP War veteran. I was going to explain, you asked why SIP did this and then put up a slide that I'm looking at right now that says why SIP did this. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we ran through the same analysis, and I think you're going to find at least the people that worked through all of that agree with the rationale here. And I think splitting it out is a good idea.
Thanks.
Neil Jenkins. I just wanted to check, did you plan to leave the other registry in place or create separate ones for each of the things that's currently sharing it?
That's not my problem. We would leave the, I think the idea here is that the HTTP header registry would be split out, and the current registry and registration procedures for the other protocols would remain the same. If those communities choose to revise their procedures, or they choose to get together and revise them en masse, that's totally up to them.
I just kind of related. And then headers that are currently only apply to HTTP within that registry, would you also kind of try to update that registry to obsolete those within there and say refer to new registry? Or
they would be taken out of the registry, and at the top you'd probably have a little thing that says, hey, if you're looking for HTTP headers, go over here.
This is Barry Liba. One of the reasons that they were put together in the first place was to make sure that header fields that had similar sense were commonly defined. But, well, they kind of are, but do you have any sense that going forward, as the registries are split, we would try to keep a coordination there so that we don't wind up with a header field that has the same name in both registries, but a vastly different function?
We already have that. We're already there. But no one, in practice, no one goes and checks to make sure that there's not a conflicting header name in the registry, for another protocol before they come up with their own. It just doesn't happen. And I think this is the core of Alexi's concern is that he likes that level of coordination. I think we can certainly come up with tools to help you have a common view of all the registries to see where there's overlap or
No, so
overlap.
I think maybe I'm not being clear.
Okay.
In the current registry, if let's say content type,
Sure.
it's the same. It's one registry. It's one name, and it has a definition.
No, it's not.
It's not.
You can have 4 or 5 however many. Yeah.
Right.
It's a double keyed registry. You look at the protocol field and the name.
Okay. Thank you.
As Murray from the floor, this in terms of how to dispatch this sort of feels like a tiny never meets in person working group rather than AD sponsored thing. But we're dispatching things, right? So
to be clear, this is the HTTP working group asking, hey, is this okay?
Yeah,
Oh,
let
I
me
thought
answer
you
your
were,
question.
I'm sorry, I thought you were asking for us where to do this.
Oh, no.
My mistake.
Pete Resnick, I am completely okay with the idea of doing this. And to go back to Barry's point about keeping coordination, what I think you're doing is sort of reversing the priority. The current registry is make sure they're coordinated, and then we're going to have different semantics by labeling them HTTP or something else. We're doing it the other way around. I think that's fine. But I do think at some point you do want to roll it back either here or somewhere else to make sure that that coordination function gets written down in some interesting way so that we continue to keep one big grand view of these things.
So what Alexi and I have talked about in the background is having some sort of alternate view, and we need to talk to Ian about this so that you can have a consolidated view of all the registries. But my observation is the audience for people who want to view it just for one protocol is pretty massive. The audience of people who want to view the consolidated view is quite small, and most of them are in this room.
Hello, Holström. To me, it seems that you're dealing with a two-level problem and should have a two-level solution. As in, it would make sense to simply put one paragraph in the HTTP registration procedure, say, and by the way, register in the common header registry. If you need to cut down the requirements of the common header registry to, yeah, someone needs to be to fill out a form, then that would be no big deal.
So you're saying that you should register everything twice?
No, I'm saying that part of the procedure of registering it once includes writing it up in two places.
I don't want to raise the bar for registering headers.
For HTTP headers or other headers?
I care about HTTP headers.
You don't want to raise the bar for registering HTTP headers?
No, I do not.
And do you think that
It's already too high.
Do you think actually noting them in the common registry would raise the bar?
Requiring people to do anything extra is raising the bar. We're dealing with a lot of people who frankly don't really care if it's registered or not, so we need to make it as easy as possible for them if we want to avoid conflicts.
That could be done back end, but I see your issue.
Yeah, John Levine, I have a question and a comment. The question is, to what extent do people use the same code to parse web stuff and to parse mail? I think there's common libraries to parse out MIME parts.
If the people are using MIME libraries to parse HTTP, they're probably doing it wrong.
Okay, I believe you. And the other thing is sort of a meta comment. In Dave Crocker's Adderleaf thing, we ran into a similar problem that the names for URI record resource record types are indirectly defined through the enum services registry, and the URI spec says, well, the names are either a protocol name like for serve, or it's a service name from enum services, and we've been scratching our, and it's sort of, since neither of them have added anything in the past decade, the overlap problem is not urgent. But I think this is now the fact that with sort of the same week, I'm running into two places where we have two registries that would be nice just to coordinate to the extent that we avoid gratuitous name collisions. Is like, I don't want to necessarily make more work for IANA, since they will cheerfully do whatever we ask them to do, including, standing on their heads and dancing. But I'm wondering if it's something we should sort of think about in general about having coordinated registries, because it comes up.
We're going to cut the line after Jonathan.
So what is the registration? I mean, what is the? Well, I forget the term. The rule for. If it's expert review.
I believe so, yes.
So there's expert review. The expert review instructions could say, make sure there isn't a conflicting header in one of the other things, or at least figure out why. And I think that's a reasonable thing for expert review, because the expert is the one who would know this, not the person doing the registration.
So to be clear, we don't have that requirement now with a combined registry. It's literally just, hey, look, there's some other ones with the same name. Think about whether or not that's a good idea.
I mean, I think the expert could be the one who says, think about. And again, it's not must not, it's the expert review is think about. So the other thing to push back against the the registering it twice thing. We've got, in RTP, we've got a dead registry of RTP payload types as well as the MIME types registry, and in theory, you're supposed to register things twice, but nobody does. So I would strongly push back against two registries because they will get out of sync really easily, despite IANA's best efforts.
Thanks.
So I have not actually heard a single person speak against doing this idea. I think that we can dispatch this as this is the way the HTTP group should proceed. Any objections to that? See lots of thumbs up. Okay, so for the minutes, we're going to proceed with the HTTP should check out of the Roach Motel and do whatever it is they do.
Thank you.
Next. Don't leave yet.
The Mark show continues.
Hi. So I have a draft that I asked to be dispatched. This is just me. So it is a very common problem out there, and there's plenty of news articles. I selected a fun one from the Register about how people get their credentials somehow released into the wild, often by checking them into a repository. Oops. And in fact, if you do a little searching around, you see lots of evidence of people who have realized this in places like GitHub and removing their authorization tokens. It's actually quite a widespread problem. There. In fact, it is so widespread that there are now tools that people have come up with to find tokens in repositories and remove them with prejudice. And indeed, GitHub has product around this. And this is really interesting. They scan for tokens in repos and do things when they find them. And they identify the formats of several common tokens, those of AWS, Azure, GitHub, Google Cloud, Slack, and Stripe. Of course, that's not the only people on the planet who use authentication tokens. And actually, before that announcement came out, I had a little bit of a brain fart on Twitter, where I said, what if we created a new URI scheme for access tokens and then GitHub refused to check in textual content that contains it? And I got a lot of interesting responses to that. And I talked to a few people in the industry, and they said, hey, we actually might use this. So that being the bar for, hey, let's try and do this for me, I wrote a quick draft called the secret token URI scheme. It is very simply a URI scheme that identifies some sort of token that you want to keep secret. It has a very permissive syntax. This happens to use a UUID. There are plenty of other things you can stuff into it. And that's it. That's the idea. And so my question to dispatch is this good enough to try? I think this sort of thing is in the class that it's a bit chicken and egg. There's interest from what I've seen in people adopting it. I talked to the engineer behind the GitHub token scanning. He was like, oh, I hadn't seen that. That looks interesting. But people are a little wary of actually producing and using or scanning for tokens in this format until it's standardized. And we don't want to standardize it without any evidence of use, so that's the chicken and the egg. And so I was wanting some feedback to see if people think this is good enough to try, and if so, should it be AD sponsored or a working group or an independent submission? Do we do it permanently, registering the URI scheme, provisionally, which as we know is very, very easy? What do people think?
This is a digression back to the previous. John Clenson, I note the decision was just made without provision for review on the mailing list. I don't have a problem with this particular decision, but it is important to note that an important IETF procedural principle was quietly ignored.
Let's just take a second to go back that for John. So, John, I did think about that before I said that. If you think we should, we will review these minutes on the list as always and go over that decision. But my thinking was that where this decision is going to actually be made is in the draft that does that registry, and that draft will be widely reviewed. All we were really doing here was discussing which mailing list that draft was going to be discussed on, which seems more of an administrative level thing than a choice of thing. So perhaps we made the wrong choice there, and I'm happy to correct that. We'll go make sure that's in the minutes and we review the mailing list. But that was what was going through my head when I said those words.
All right, Paul Hoffman talking about this draft, although actually only obliquely. being able to search for things easily in GitHub has a lot of value. And I work at ICANN. Some of you know that we just rolled the root KSK. It was pointed out to us a couple months before the roll that there were a bunch of repos that had the old KSK and not the new KSK in them. And so that indicated, oh, maybe they didn't know to update. And we mechanically went through as many as we could and sent issues, like mechanically sent issues to a lot of people saying, don't know if this matters or whatever. We got a lot of very positive response back. We got a little bit of negative response. We got a lot of positive response. Some of it saying, don't worry about it. No one's ever, no one has implemented. But some people going, oh, wow, shit, you're right. So something like this, even if GitHub doesn't prohibit it, but just being able to mark something like this so that white hats or gray hats can find it. We were surprised. We thought we would just get flamed for because we said we are spamming this issue, like no human typed this. We still got a lot of very positive response back and fixes. So I think that even if you can't get GitHub to prohibit this, but if you get any uptake at all, it will have a positive value on the world.
Ted Hardy, this seems like a classic case where making it provisional and upgrading it if we see use would be exactly in line with the way that's described. So unless you feel like people won't take it up because they don't believe in provisionals, and that's certainly not my experience, I would say that would be the way to go.
I tend to agree. As long as it's an RFC, I think it'll be fine.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, I think that's a reasonable approach. I note that the hyphen has caused you a problem already. I know it's a bike shed, but I'd just like to raise that point.
We're going to ignore that comment.
So is there any, does anyone have any advice about what path this should take?
Let me phrase that slightly more pointed. Would any AD object to sponsoring this if we suggested AD sponsored was the ideal path for this?
Especially considering how many documents I've agreed to shepherd recently.
Wow, now that was blatantly, I love it.
Yeah, I just spoke to Alexi and I just heard Ben, this is Adam Roach. We have no objection to AD sponsoring this. No one's jumping up to do it, but I'm sure we can find a stucky.
Okay, so I'm going to make our proposal. The question I'm going to ask in a minute is, so we suggest AD sponsorship. So if anybody wants to say that's the wrong path, now would be a great time to speak to that. And we'll let Jonathan go speak about whatever he planned to speak about.
Yes, so I was going to ask, this is a sort of amusing question somebody asked in the Jabber, but also sort of, somebody asked, are you planning to have this draft checked into GitHub? And more generally, presumably your code for scanning for the secret token should itself be checked into GitHub. So is there a way to say this, this contains the string secret token because I'm documenting how you name your secret tokens, but it's not actually a token?
So that sounds like a user experience problem, which we don't do at the IETF.
We'll use the hyphen to control that.
Right. I think if I remember correctly, GitHub doesn't preclude you from checking it in. It just warns you. Although you can set it so that it can preclude it. I'm sure that they've thought through these issues and have adjusted accordingly. I hope we don't need to deal with that problem. But then there's encoding. We could just encode it. And I guess my only other question would be, is there any preference about whether such an AD-sponsored document would be informational or standards track? Fine by me. Ted said from the floor for provisional informational, I think. Sure. Thanks.
Okay. So. So, oh, sorry. There we go.
Watch this.
You may have to point this way.
There, all done.
Perfect.
This is a topic that has come up before. Pretty much every web form ever written accepts an email address, and it is pretty common to verify the email address using a regular expression. And people I know at ICANN have actually hired somebody to go and look at web forms and like the Alexa Top 1000 or something and see how they verify the email addresses. And pretty much without exception, they use some random regular expression that some guy wrote who didn't actually understand mail syntax. So since we're all about standards and interoperability, Sean Leonard and some other people, sort of including me, wrote up some actual correct regular expressions to match both normal ASCII email addresses and EAI email addresses, which are actually fairly complicated because mail syntax is complicated, but who cares? You just plug it in. So our goal is simple. It's simply to first get them reviewed to make sure they actually are correct, and then publish them and say, hey, instead of inventing a regular expression, use this one. And assuming Mark is still in the room, I'm also wondering how we might socialize this among the web community where it actually cares, where it actually matters, where people should care. So I guess I think this is, give or take, verifying the regular expression. This is basically done. So I'm hoping it can be, I hope it can be dispatched directly or AD sponsored or whatever is easiest. Well, I don't know. You're the chair. Yeah.
So the question is about where to dispatch this. And one of the issues is like, I think, and in my thinking about how to dispatch this, I'd be asking, where is the expertise to review these regular expressions? Because they're provably not easy to get right. That's why we're writing this draft.
Well, I think the guy standing there probably could be one of the reviewers.
Maybe. Neil Jenkins, that's very loud. First of all, I think it's a great idea. I agree that we see all sorts of random rubbish all over the internet. And I think if you publish it, I think you will eventually get people linking to it and people will find it and start using it more and more. So I think it's a great idea. Just the one thing I would want to point out, though, is that just because it is valid according to the spec doesn't mean that all software supports it. And sometimes the regular expressions that people do use don't match everything that is technically valid, but might match things that they can actually process. And also, there's the other side of that of sometimes the regular expressions fail to match against things that would technically be valid, but actually are a mistake on the user and a common mistake, and no one really uses it in real life. So there is a reason why people don't necessarily always, like, it's not just because they got it wrong. Sometimes they have a reason why they didn't use an exact RFC compliant kind of match.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I personally, I wouldn't be opposed to having, sort of a cut down version that's supposed to more likely to work, with Outlook or wherever, or Exchange or something. But in a lot of cases, it's just like, people have never seen a plus sign in an address, so it just doesn't accept it. It's that level of mistake that we're trying to fix. Yeah.
So one of the other questions I wonder if you guys thought about is, in some ways, an RFC is like the least useful way to deliver this to people. Like, I agree, we sort of need one to give it the compound of that, but is this a possibility for some experimentation with tools and how we write stuff to be able to deliver this in a form that's more useful for developers than how we usually give stuff to?
I don't see those as exclusive. I mean, it's very useful. I can tell you in other communities, it's very useful, like, given the misconception that all RFCs are standards engraved in concrete, is useful here.
Right.
Yeah.
Ben Campbell.
Ooh.
Either hot today. We've had a few other drafts come by where the nature of the draft is, here is an implementation that we believe is correct of how to do a certain thing to meet, to meet the standard, where the standard is something else. In this case, the standard would be the syntax for the addresses.
Yeah. And
we've sent those to the ISC. Now, I don't mean that to mean it's not valuable or anything like that. It's been more of a, well, it's not really, this is just something you can use. It's not we're trying to say this is the right thing to use or anything like that, but just something you can use. So I'm not saying it needs to be that way, but I was just bringing that up as a thought.
I mean, technically, you are absolutely correct. Like, these addresses are specified in ABNF, and with a suitably brilliant compiler, which will be able to translate the ABNF into your favorite regular expression language. It's just that we haven't, and ABNF is, I believe the ABNF is sufficiently ambiguous that the translation is kind of tricky.
Dave Crocker and I did what we called, and I think this is what Ben's talking about, an applicability statement on
Yeah.
gray listing. And we did that through the I think we did that through the IESG as an informational or something like that.
That'll be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, Tail, I wanted to agree with John's statement that, you know, the relative weight that being an RFC carries makes a big difference. As somebody who frequently feels like he's shouting at the wind for wanting to use addresses with plus signs in them, I think that this is extremely useful. It's not the only approach you take, but it's the fallback approach, because when I point out to people there are internet standards that define a plus as being perfectly legitimate, they're like, okay, but how do I code that? And if they want to use regular expressions, this will, you know, show an IETF sponsored way of this is how you go about and do it, but then you use other website tools to, you know, get it out there and get it in the fold. And that also makes me wonder why not, you know, why did it have to be part of a working group? Why not just AD sponsored in defense of submission, you know, without being in a working group?
I don't and just make it clear, people are using regular expressions now, but they're wrong. Yeah.
Well, and speaking of regular
Kurt,
expression.
who are you?
Kurt Anderson. So it's one thing to match the left-hand side. Are you also proposing for this regular expression to validate the right-hand side, the domain aspect of the email address? Because you, by definition, you can't.
Only syntactically. I mean, if you want to,
Right.
if you want to validate it by looking it up, that's, you know, you can do so, but that's different.
Well, and I think that goes back to the applicability statement space, because people just don't understand that validating a syntax doesn't give you a valid domain.
Yeah, but just to be clear, people get that wrong too. You know, there are plenty.
Well,
of,
they get it hugely wrong. And that's what I'm pointing out, is that we need to somehow have bold flashing letters around this, that validating the syntax does not mean you have a valid domain.
but it goes in the other direction. There's still plenty of regular expressions where nobody ever saw a top level domain longer than 5 letters.
I agree. And it's equally broken there too.
Yeah.
So.
Harry Wallström, just admin, where's the draft?
It's expired.
How's it feel that? Okay.
Neil Jenkins, just wanted to quickly clarify, this regular expression is just meant to match the email address, not like a full mailbox string in a, MIME header, like, with a name part or comment or anything like that. You know, it's,
Yeah, this is just
the email.
It's just like, you know, what's your name? What's your email?
Yeah.
Check here to receive unlimited spam. We're familiar with that form. Yeah. Okay. Well, whatever you guys say.
This is also not a helpful comment.
Stop now.
That's what we're here for.
I mean, we should say I'm creating more problems rather than more solutions. It has also been commented that no two regular expression implementations work alike. So how are you deciding which ones are most useful to target?
Oh, we're specifically targeting the one in JavaScript and the one in Perl.
Okay.
I believe it's been a while since I looked at it, but I think, but we had particular widely used ones in mind. Yeah.
We were just about to maybe say the words ISE, unless you had some other advice for us. What do you wish to say there?
Well, yes. Guess who IC will ask to review this document anyway? So I think considering the expertise is somewhat in this room and some people online, I probably think that AD sponsored probably a better way.
So
obviously it will be better if we make a mistake in the regular expression and then publish RFC, but I think we'll probably get more reviews here. So.
I was looking to see if this actually might fit in extra, and it doesn't, but that audience is also present in that room, so maybe you could take a couple of minutes to mention it there. I mean, that's supposed to be about mail stores, not about forms and things, but that audience is there is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I sort of might need to reach out extra, but that's one possibility actually.
I mean, I plan to go to extra if there's time at AOB, I'll blurb it.
How about this as a proposed path forward that people can comment on? But here's a straw man: is AD sponsored, but when the IETF last call is done, we make sure that we call that out, and maybe beforehand call it out in every working group that defined one of the specs that that drove this regular expression, right? Like wherever the A, B, and F was defined in the specification that nailed these things, in those places we commented out. And I'm not saying co-working group last call it across 10 working groups, but just at least call it out in every working group that would have the expertise, who's impacted by, who has a standard impacted by this spec.
I think the working groups that did this were disbanded
Are
a
gone
decade
now,
ago.
I know,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, the mailing list are still around, so
Yeah.
IETF-SMTP, for example.
And I'm sure that relevant people are on the phone. So yeah.
Okay. So we'll propose to the mailing list that they can, to move this forward as AD sponsored, as a path forward. Actually, we don't do anything on that. The AD just does it. So I think we'll take that as the call, if that's the direction it's going to go, unless anyone wants to speak against that. Okay, thank you. Don't go far. Oh yeah, you've got one more. Oh yeah, we got to get a business first. And that one. Okay. So we are ending the dispatch meeting and moving on to the art area meeting, which we do not chair, but we will chair. So starting with area directors, updates, cluster 238. Tell us how it goes.
It goes fine. Adam Roach. So the WebRTC documents, the last ones that are actually dependencies for cluster 238, have all been publication requested. I have my area director review done for those, and we're waiting for some relatively small updates to two of them and some clarifications in a third one that we're going to be talking about in WebRTC, in the RTC Web Working Group on Thursday. So if anyone's interested in how those final resolutions play out, to sort of watch the setting of the sun, you can come do that. And after that, we only have two relatively small dependencies to come out of payload, and I think it's MMusic where they're doing the ISSDP. And after that, the whole cluster breaks free. So we're going to have like this, I think Ben called it the cluster of Damocles, finally drop onto the RFC editor sometime, probably this quarter or first quarter of next year, and there's going to be an incredible delay in publication of everything else. I think we're going to have like 20 consecutive RFC numbers. And that's, I think, all that I have from the art area. That's kind of the big thing going on right now.
This is Ben. I was just going to add, anyone involved in cluster 238, be prepared to owe the RFC editor the drinks of their choice.
Do we have anybody in the room that wants to speak to rats or WUG? Woof.
It rhymes with all of them. If you were at the first woof woog boff, you would know that we already made that joke. So if you were at the first boff, which was maybe a year or 2 years ago, we basically just wanted to say, gee, working groups are using GitHub. What does that mean to the IETF? And there was lots of mic line and such like that. The BOF this week in specific is about a new draft that Alyssa Cooper and I have written that says, gee, it seems like working groups who haven't started using GitHub want a way to do that more easily. And, you know, they've asked 3 other working groups who are already doing GitHub what they're doing, and they're all doing radically different things. And so they just sort of stop. So one of the ideas that we had in the draft is, why don't we just say what the data tracker should do, if everyone agrees that this is a good idea, to create a repo, make responsible people and all of that. So that's part of what the BOF will be doing this week. We will also go back and revisit the issue of, well, what should working groups be doing or not. I put out a call for people to, because we have plenty of open mic time at the end, to say what their working group is doing with GitHub that is interesting, like when they've noticed that other people aren't doing it and such. So it'll be a general discussion. Just to be clear, there is, as far as I know, no chance that what's going to come out of this is a requirement to use GitHub, a prohibition on using GitHub, or even something saying if you're using GitHub, you have to do it like this other thing is. And certainly in this room, that's pretty relevant because the HTTP BIS working group and folks like that tend to be very aggressive in the way that they use GitHub, and lots of other working groups are actually very passive and partial. And as far as we can tell, that's all fine. So the mic line will probably be the most interesting part of the BOF. And if you have opinions, which most people do, because most people have opinions about blockchain because it's blockchain. Almost everyone has an opinion about GitHub because it involves the word Git. So if you have opinions, come. What we would like the mic line to be is, I have this opinion, but I'm certainly willing to listen to other people. And then not have the person behind them agree or disagree, but just to be putting out the idea that after a few years of usage, we have working groups, again, HTTP BIS being really the prime example, of people who are really into this. And do they want other people to be doing it like them, or are they like, no, this is the way we're doing it, but if you want to do it like us, here's how we do it. So it really is a BOF in the sense that even though we have a draft, we're not really aiming at a super specific result.
I'm just going to mention when you stepped away that it's Wednesday at 1:50.
Right. So yeah, it's so funny to have 1:50 be immediately after lunch. But yeah. So yeah, please come by. And we have a mailing list already, which is not that one, but ask me afterwards. But we want to help working groups, and we're not sure what that means. So come on by.
So I searched the announced list and found no new working groups formed since 102. So that's the basis of that slide. If I should be looking at a different source, let me know. And I think John had one more, or did you do both of yours?
Yeah, no, we have one more.
Okay. That's it.
Just watch this. Okay.
Successful test.
Yeah. This is another draft, which I think is still alive, but SPF and DKIM were both invented either before before EAI existed, or at least before it was well specified, and DMARC. Let me see if I can do this in a coherent sentence. SPF, the specification of SPF says nothing about how it works in the presence of EAI mail. DKIM and DMARC sort of wave their hands and don't get it quite right. So this is a short update for each of these three things to say, if you are doing an SPF check on an EAI message, do it this way. If you are doing DKIM signing and verification on EAI messages, do it this way. And if you're doing what DMARC does on EAI messages, do it this way. And I've actually implemented the SPF and DKIM things. They're both pretty straightforward. So it's basically anywhere that you can have a normal ASCII A label, you can now also have a U label. And it clarifies things that, like in the SPF records themselves and the DKIM validation records, since they live in the DNS and can be used to validate anything, they don't actually have any EAI stuff in them. They just have ASCII in them. You know, and it says things like that. It shouldn't be controversial, and at least for the SPF and DKIM parts, I'm pretty sure they work since the code works. So again, I'm hoping to move this ahead as minor updates for these three things. The one process issue is that SPF and DKIM are standards crack, whereas DMARC is either informational or experimental.
It's currently informational.
It's currently informational. So whatever you have to do to be able to document, but I would rather not split this up. I would rather just have one thing that updates all three of them. And again, this is not intended to be contentious. It's all supposed to be pretty straight. This sort of writing down clearly what sort of the obvious way to do this.
Kurt Anderson. We've also got two specifications that are in process from the DMARC working group that both reference this document in terms of 7601 BIS and the ARC protocol. And so it'd be nice to be able to refer to something that's not a draft that will expire every 6 months.
Yeah, and also it doesn't update ARC because ARC is new enough that we actually managed to get this stuff in this is the first time around.
Right, but ARC does point to this document to say this shows you how to do it right.
Yeah, and also ARC does depend on DKIM, so it's helpful to have this done.
Exactly.
ARC
Yeah,
will-
it depends on DKIM and DMARC as updated by this document.
So ARC won't refer to a dead document. It would be held for publication for this, which probably is also not something you want.
This is Barry Leba. I agree that it would be nice not to split this up. The only thing that gives me a little pause is that it is possible that the DMARC working group will take as a future step, a near future step, to come up with a standards track version of DMARC. Presumably that standards track version of DMARC would incorporate this.
Well, it would be newer than this, so yeah.
Right. And therefore, you'd have part of this. It's possible that the standards track version would do it slightly differently, perhaps, if we put it together. Maybe not. The point is, having that broken out makes it easy for us to just obsolete that and put it into the base standards track DMARC without affecting whatever you say about SPF and DKIM. It's a minor thing. I'm just throwing it out.
Yeah, that gives me, that's a reason not to break it out, because I'm pretty sure I did it right, and if you did it any other way, it would probably not be right. I mean, there aren't. I mean, if you look at what it says, it's
Part
really
of the
simple.
problem is that DMARC depends on SPF and DKIM.
Right. And it's all sort of a tangled bit. I mean, there is a little bit of arrogance involved in saying, I'm sure I got it right and nobody's ever going to find an error in it. And if
I'm not saying that.
and I don't mean that in a negative way. What I'm saying though is, I think I've made myself clear.
Actually,
it's a small point. I don't really care that
Let
much. I
me
just wanted
flip
to
this
bring it up.
around. Let me encourage anybody who cares about DMARC to take a look at it and make sure we got it right.
Ted Hardy, channeling John Clenson from the Jabber chat room. The EEI working group actually reached out to DKIM and, if I recall, SPF to try to get this sorted and was basically blown off. I agree that addressing this in a careful way is appropriate and overdue.
Thank you.
Is this something that we should just sort of take, Kurt Anderson again, that we should take on again within the DMARC working group and then just bring it forward that way? I see kind of a half shaking of a head by Murray.
I had the same idea originally, and then I went and read the charter, and it's outside that. So the guy you need to convince is now at the mic.
Yeah. Well, rechartering is easy if you know what you're doing. So I was about to ask the same question. So thank you.
Yeah, and that's why I didn't sit down, because this is Barry Leba. That was my next statement, was we should just pick this up in DMARC, and I say that as a current chair of the DMARC working group.
Fine with me.
And then that answers the dispatch question very quickly, even though we're not in dispatch now.
Okay. For me. That's the end of our.
So I think open mic.
Because of the general absence of controversy, but I think those.
I believe the summary of the non-dispatch item was that we would dispatch it to DMARC, which would need to recharter.
Yeah, Adam Roach, I was going to say, what I wanted to capture there was that it would involve rechartering DMARC to include this specifically.
I would encourage interested DMARC parties to send me updated text this week.
Hi, Aaron Falk, Akamai, speaking of TAPS Working Group Chair. Sorry for being distracted. My laptop just bricked, and I'm like looking at my productivity for the rest of the week just plummeting. But the reason I wanted to get up to the microphone is because those of you who've been around for more than a couple of years may recall that I showed up here a while ago talking about the Transport Services Working Group, which is not surprisingly in the transport area, and has been working on defining an abstract APIs that the goal here is to have an API that would be present in operating systems. Applications could then bind to, instead of calling specific transport protocols, express the capabilities that they want from the transport protocol, whether they want reliability, or partial reliability, with the different security parameters. So the things that allow you, that distinguish between different transport protocols, not just TCP and UDP, but also SCTP, DCCP, QUIC. And then the thing on the other side of the API would probe what would work end to end through the network, and support things like MPTCP where available, or using the happy eyeballs approach that they use for doing things like racing for IPv4 and IPv6. So the goal here was to make it easier for applications developers to take advantage of capabilities of new protocols without having to build a mechanism in to bind to those protocols, determine if they were going to work, fail over to something else if it didn't. And so the working group has been sort of chewing away at this for several years now, and we've got some vendor engagement. Apple's actually got something that's very compatible with this, and there's an architecture, and the abstract API is starting to settle. And so it's kind of a good time for folks who have an applications background to take a look at this. And from your point of view, because the transport guys are, we're sort of bottoms up looking at this problem. And I think that from the application down, you'll probably have some different insights. And so the working group's kind of heading into the home stages where we're starting to polish up the documents. And so if there's any major course corrections, it would be really helpful to get them in this time frame. So TAPS meets Wednesday afternoon, I think at 3 something. And so you can just tune into the meeting. But I actually mostly encourage you to go look at the working group documents. There's one that is called the TAPS interface specification, and see if the abstractions in there actually kind of make sense from an application perspective. So, and send comments to the group. Thank you.
Adam Roach, I just wanted to give the suggestion, you might want to send a mail to the ICE mailing list. I don't know if we're going to keep that open after the working group closes, Ben. Is that probably staying open? Okay, because you probably have some people there that have worked through solving some of the problems that you're likely going to encounter south of this API, and they might be able to provide.
Abstractions that will allow you to tell me what my public IP is.
Right. Sorry.
So, yeah, short version is we're aware that's an issue. Hadn't occurred to me to approach the working group, so that's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, unless there's any other topics, I think we will call it the end of the meeting. Thank you all.
Blue sheets, anyone? If anyone did not sign the blue sheets, please come up front. They're both here.
I'm sorry if I revealed something I wasn't supposed to.
I assume it's hot.
I mean, it's not urgent.
I think we can deal with one shoot or two shooters.
No. It's fine. I may pick up another one.
Spark range.
I will do this now.